My name is Calvin Bishop. I was asked to give a brief report here about my experiences during World War II. The first item on the list that was given to me is, where was I on December 7th? I was down here at 18th Street in Yucaipa Boulevard, probably reading or listening to some music. They broke into the program, and this was a Sunday morning, December 7th, and they broke into the program stating that they were stopping all broadcasts to announce that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. And so that's where I was. My mother was up at the Yucaipa Baptist Church, and I don't know where the rest of the family was. I was the only one home. But as soon as people started getting home, I said, "Did you hear about what happened at Pearl Harbor?" So they'd all heard about it already. So that was the beginning. The first thing they were doing then was compulsory draft. And so I was a senior in high school at that time. So when I turned 18, I had to sign up for the draft. And the letter I got in the mail went something like this: "You have been selected." Made it sound important, didn't it? You have been selected. Out of all the people in the United States, you've been selected to be drafted. Okay, well, I got my notice in the mail. I was to be in Redlands at a certain time on a certain morning. That was April 26th, 1944. Excuse me, 1943. I got on a bus full of people from Redlands. We're going to Los Angeles. We got down there to a big building. It was filled with buses. The place we went into was filled with people. It'd be in the thousands, and we all had to stand there and say, "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth." I guess that's law courts, isn't it? Well, this is where we're being sworn into the Army, and we had to pledge to do the best we could to defend the country against a common enemy. Well, that was all there was that day, April 26th. We got right back on the bus. I came right back to Redlands. And the first thing they did, they gave me a week's vacation. I had 7 days off. Boy, I thought that was nice of them. Well, 1 week later, went down to Redlands again, and I was put on a bus to go to the Arlington Reception Center. That is over in the area where Jack lives. So do you know where Jack Bermane lives? Andrew does. That was what was called the Arlington Reception Center. I was there for 5 days. They told us right away when we got there, "We're not going to teach you to march here. You're just here until we can assign you to a place where they need men." So at the time I arrived at the Arlington Reception Center, they needed men to train for the field artillery. So that's where I went. They told me that they weren't going to, or they told us, "We're not going to show you how to march. That's going to be back where you take your basic." And but they did have us take off all our clothes. They told us, "Don't bring any extra clothes because it's all going to be sent home." So we had to take all of our clothes. We went through a line, just a bunch of naked men, one after another. They were checking us, first of all, for venereal disease. I've often thought, I wonder how those doctors enjoyed that. I can't imagine that. But then we went through a line to get our clothes. And so we had to get clothes that were the right size. And so from then on, everything I wore was military. A drab olive color. So I was there for 5 days. They put me on a train. They told me I was going to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. But they must have thought I was somebody important because they gave me a sleeper. Everyone else that I've talked to when they went in the Army, they just got a chair car. But they gave me a sleeper. And that was pretty nice. Kind of the swaying of the train on the tracks. It rocked me to sleep the first night, and each night. I really enjoyed that. But then we got to the state of Texas. They told us, you're going to be on this, in the state of Texas for approximately 24 hours. And we were. That was a long ride across Texas. Lots of songs about Texas out there. The eyes of Texas are upon you. We got back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And there's where the fun started. There's where they began ordering us around. And one thing we all had to learn right away, do as you're told. Obedience. Do exactly what you're told. There's going to be a penalty for anything that you're doing wrong. Boy, I was lonely back there. I didn't know any of the guys I was with. Every morning it was the same thing. We'd have to fall out and get in formation, try to form a straight line. We couldn't even do that to begin with. And then we began learning to march. That was the first thing we learned to do, was to march. I guess it's the hardest for everyone to learn. See, some guys were tall, other guys were short, long legs, short legs. Everyone was supposed to take the same length of steps. How do you do that? Practice, practice, practice. So we did that every morning. And then, of course, we'd have seminars, talks being given to us. We were shown motion pictures of warfare, what the Japanese were doing in China, and what Italy had done in Ethiopia, and what Germany had done, gobbling up land in Europe. And the reason of these motion pictures were to get us to hate the enemy. That's the bottom line. And we had a lot of that. Well, we had to learn to fire guns. There even in Fort Bragg, I fired both the rifle and the carbine, by the way. And then we took training on the Long Tom. It was a gun that was several feet longer. The barrel was several feet longer than the howitzer that we had when we went overseas, but it shot the same shell. So we went through all that we had to learn about firing a gun. We all learned to do the same thing, and then certain ones were picked out to do certain things later. One of the things I remember about that little episode in Fort Bragg was that I was sitting in a bunch of poison ivy when we were having one of these interesting talks. And that was a miserable time. They gave me calamine lotion. They told them this will ease the itch and help it to heal. I might have been all of 1 minute with the doctor. And but we have to stay in the barracks? No, we're out there the next morning marching. March, march, march. Well, the orders came down for us, we were going to get on a train for New York City. We were going to be going to England and then over to France. Just the day before we left, they pulled me from that group because I didn't have 2 pair of government issue glasses. So I was held up. Boy, that was another heartbreak for me. I just get to know these guys and now they're no more around. So they held me up. I think it was the second day my glasses had arrived, so they put me on a train instead of to New York City. We were headed for St. Louis, Missouri. We were going to Fort Leonard Wood, what they call advanced training. I didn't like it to begin with, but I look back and see that I'm glad I didn't go with that first group, because they put that first group of our group in to replace people who were killed in the invasion. And so I'm glad that I got the trip to Fort Leonard Wood instead of to New York City right away. That group that we were with, we saw some guys afterward that we knew. They entered France, I think, 3 days after D-Day. They said to us we were cut to ribbons. That's the way they put it. Well, I went to Fort Leonard Wood. They were just forming the 754th Field Artillery Battalion. They had brought men in from Tonga that was down in the South Pacific. They were going to be our enlisted men, sergeants and whatnot. So they were over the gun sections. They'd had experience. They'd been in the service for several years. And there's where they really nailed us about marching. You're going to have to keep in step, keep a straight line when you're walking, and of course behind it all, do as you're told. Don't slack off. Well, we arrived there in Fort Leonard Wood in the fall, and we had a bad winter in Fort Leonard Wood. Oh, it was cold. But there we were training on a howitzer. So we went through all the stuff that we'd learned on the Long Tom, and we had to go through everything on the howitzer then. We had one of the things we did there, winter was coming on, and the company had invented new tents. It was supposed to help keep the soldier warm just from the breathing of men in that tent. I think we're 2 of us, maybe 4 to a tent, I don't remember now. But the breathing was supposed to keep the tent warm. I don't think it heated the tent at all, and condensation was forming on the top of that tent and dripping down on our faces. We never saw those tents again, so that was a failure. But that's where I took my advanced training in Fort Leonard Wood. We got our officers, we got our assignments. Okay, I found out at one of the reunions that I went to, several times I talked with a man who assigned every one of us to what we were to do. He'd never met any of us, and yet he assigned every one of us to what we're going to do. You know that Jeep I have in the den? He's the one that made that Jeep, and he made 2 vehicles for Stephen. And anyway, he signed me to instrument and survey, and that required me to be the Jeep driver for the officer. So we trained together through the winter months there at Fort Leonard Wood. One of the things that I look back on with kind of sad memories is this guy by the name of Baines that didn't know frontwards from backwards. He was in pretty bad shape. But every time we were lined up, Baines, get in step. Baines, get in step. One day we were to come out with our guns, helmets, coats on. He came out without something missing. Baines, go back and get your helmet. Came back out without his gun. Baines, go back and get your gun. And this went on for minutes. We were standing out there waiting to get to marching. Well, poor old Baines, he had a low IQ, and we never saw him after the outfit broke up to go to New York. That's the thing I remember about Baines. One of those, okay, I'll tell you about the firing of guns. We had to learn firing guns from a standing position, from a kneeling position, and from a prone position. Not on your back, in the prone position. Firing at the targets back there, sometimes they were 50 yards away, other times 100 yards away. And we had to follow these commands. The instructor would say, ready on the right, if everything's okay. Ready on the left, okay. And then commence firing. There's when we begin to pull the trigger. Well, this one instant, the command had just come down, ready on the right. Bang! Baines had fired his gun. It stopped everything. Everyone had to stop and be told again when to fire the gun. That's the experience with Baines. But he never went overseas with us. Okay, next story is a person in our outfit. He was chosen to lay the battery with an aiming circle to make sure the gun was pointed in the right direction. This is just before we headed for Europe. The big general was up in the stands watching our firing. We were supposed to do the firing to make sure that we were ready for combat. We used an aiming circle. It had 6,400 mils. And apparently he laid the battery 1,000 mils out. When that shell hit, it was in front of the general, but not an awful long ways in front of him. It was supposed to have been miles away. Well, that stopped everything. They had an investigation wondering why that battery was laid 1,000 mils out. They came up with an excuse. There must have been a magnetic field underneath the the aiming circle. So we got off, but from that time on, this guy by the name of Nuss was called Knucklehead because he laid the battery 1,000 mils out. Knucklehead now, Nuss. Well, this same person, when we were in the combat zone, during some of the toughest times, he had found a German violin, and the kitchen crew was cleaning up after supper. And there was Nuss out there. I was told, I didn't see this, I was told by the men that were there, he was naked. He didn't have any clothes on playing the violin for the kitchen crew. Well, a German artillery shell came in and hit close to him, and he was knocked out of action right away. He wasn't killed. He had to go back to the medical center behind the lines, then to England, then back to the United States. But he was hit from head to foot also, because that shell didn't land too far from him. And I saw him at one of the reunions, and I said, "Do you remember why you got the name Knucklehead?" He said, "Yeah, I laid the battery 1,000 mils out." Oh, and another thing in relation to Nuss almost getting killed, we had a young kid. He was a Mexican kid but he only had one lung, and his chest was caved in on the other side. And I don't remember if it was an air raid or whether it's an artillery shell that got him, but an artillery shell or a bomb landed close to him, and it so happened that one of the pieces of shrapnel went through his good lung. So his name was Quinones, so he died on the spot there. But we escaped out of the general's hand, and he had us sent to Europe. We had to pack everything we had into our duffel bag. Stephen calls a little duffel bag, kind of a shaving kit, his duffel bag, but our duffel bag held everything that we were going to need. We arrived at New York early part of August, and we were told this is going to be heavy. You're going to have to pace yourself. You're going to have to try to stay in line and not lag. If you have to step out so someone else can get going too. Okay, we had these heavy duffel bags on our shoulders. Well, we got on board ship and passed the Statue of Liberty and said goodbye to the United States. We were on a ship that they told us was captured from the Germans in World War I. But that was my first cruise, by the way, all expenses paid. But we were stacked 6 high every deck. What a miserable time it was traveling. Boy, talk about not having any time of your own. Just jammed in there tight. Well, I spent my 20th birthday on board that ship just before we got to Liverpool, England. In Liverpool, we got off. They put us on trucks, I think it was, and hauled us down to southern England, what they call sunny Cornwall County. I was told that people from all over the British Empire would come there to this sunny Cornwall County because it was warmer there than it was up north. Well, that's where we were. It is actually a staging area for us before we got on the LSTs, stands for Landing Ship Tanks. That's what we went to France on. But we got all new equipment, all new guns. Everything was brand new while we were there. And I had to learn to drive on the left-hand side of the street. So that was a new experience for me. But I didn't have an accident driving in England. We got by okay. We got on this landing ship for tanks. Ours were for the guns and the vehicles. We were told, before you go down the ramp, make sure you are going slow. Don't hit the water with a splash. Don't step on it before you get into the water. Wait till you're in the water and then step on it so you can get up on the bank. There's the possibility of flooding the engines of vehicles. So we got off in France. We got off in what they call the hedgerow country of France. And that's where the Germans had left explosive devices. If you pull a branch, it could explode. So that was everywhere. They warned us, don't touch these hedgerows. So we got out of that without any casualties. And then we made the long trek across France. And just very few months previous to that, General Patton had led his tank corps across France, through Paris, and made a wedge inside Germany, at Aachen, Germany. Well, I was told by someone that had seen the Arc de Triomphe. You'll be able to see this for miles before you get there. And it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You just can't believe how big that Arc de Triomphe is. And he was exactly right. We could see that for miles, getting closer and closer and closer. Now, right now, you can't go through the Arc de Triomphe, but it seems to me that I drove right through it. With this huge, immense monument. It was a big general in France. What was the name of a big general or a dictator? Who was it?
Napoleon?
Napoleon. Napoleon had that built commemorating his victories. So it was the thing to see. Well, we kept going, and we got up near Belgium, Luxembourg, Maastricht. Maastricht is a town where Cadex now have an electronics plant. They've been over there for probably 25 years of producing their electronics equipment. But they moved us into a place right in the triangle where Patton had gone in and secured the town of Aachen. So this is where we were to go. And they had us in a little bit east of Aachen, and